Welcome to everyone joining the proactive maintenance webinar. We'll give people a couple more minutes to log in and then we'll get started. Welcome to everybody joining this proactive maintenance webinar. We'll give it about one more minute, let people log in, and then we'll get started. Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome to this product support webinar on proactive maintenance. My name is Brad Sexauer. I'm a clinical education specialist with Sentec, and I'll be moderating this webinar today. So a couple housekeeping items. So before we begin, keep in mind that you can ask a question at any point during the webinar. Just click on that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. We'll answer those questions at the end of the webinar. If you happen to have any technical difficulties, we have somebody on the back end who can help you out with that. So if you do, go ahead and type those into the chat box and we'll help you out as much as possible. Now, I'm happy to introduce our speaker for today, Jason Rohrer. Jason is a national product implementation manager with Sentec and has more than a decade of experience in non-invasive patient monitoring, mechanical ventilation, respiratory care, and biomedical service. He is a member of the American Association of Respiratory Care. Jason is passionate about working with neonatologists, respiratory therapists, nurses, anesthesiologists, and other healthcare providers in need of continuous non-invasive transcutaneous CO2 monitoring solutions. So with that, I'd like to welcome Jason. And Jason, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Brad, for that nice introduction. And again, welcome everyone to this proactive maintenance webinar. Before I get started, I'll just say that the content that I'm going to share here today, I want you to think of this as the foundation for our technology to work properly. So definitely get your pen out, take some notes. This information I really am confident is going to help you have a better overall experience with your transcutaneous monitors. So after this presentation today, hopefully you'll be able to summarize the recommended daily, weekly, monthly, as well as quarterly proactive maintenance for the monitor and sensor. Also be able to explain how to do a clean and soak, and also why it's important to do a sensitivity test and just the reasons for that. And then at the very end, Brad will actually tell you where to find some further resources and other content that I think you'll find helpful. So this overview here is going to be everything that we're going to cover over the next 20 to 25 minutes. Take a picture of this with your phone. This will just be a nice reminder to you so that after this webinar, you can kind of reference back to this and remember some of the things that we talked about. So obviously before and after each use, you don't need to do anything with the monitor, but the sensor you do want to visually inspect and clean that with 70% alcohol. Weekly, you will want to clean and disinfect the monitor, docking station, gasket. We're going to talk about all that in more detail in the coming slides, as well as the sensor adapter cable. And then monthly is where kind of the bulk of this work gets done as far as proactive maintenance. That's because that's when the membrane is going to need to be changed on the sensor. So you'll do that membrane change, you'll run a sensitivity test, and this is really a great time for you to check PAR levels on your disposable items. Maybe you might need to order some more membrane changers or CalGas or gel or some of the adhesive options that we have for the sensor. So just check your supply levels, make sure you have everything that you need, reach out to us and we can help you place an order for some more of those if needed. And then quarterly, I'm going to explain how to do that clean and soak and why it's important. So I just want you to see what a good sensor should look like. On the left there is what we want your sensor to look like after you've done a membrane change. And really what you're looking for here is a nice dark gray color underneath the membrane red LED is illuminated, the silver chloride ring is intact. We're going to talk about all that in detail, but I just wanted you to have a visual reference to what a good sensor should look like. And on the right here, we have some examples of sensors that aren't in good working order. Top left is a sensor that actually needs the membrane change because that electrolyte has dried out. You can tell that actually by the color. You can see it's a light gray, hazy, milky color. That indicates that electrolyte between the membrane and the sensor face is drying out or has completely dried out, and a membrane change will need to be done. On the right of that, in upper right, is a sensor with a missing membrane, and it's surprising how often I see this as I'm out in hospitals and visiting different customers each week. We do see this pretty frequently where the membrane's just missing, and if you do happen to see that, you want to go ahead and change that membrane. In the lower left is an example of a sensor where the silver chloride ring has failed. It's turned that white or silver color in the middle. That indicates that the sensor is faulty and will need to be completely replaced. So reach out to our team if you do have a sensor that looks like that, and we'll help you get that replaced as needed. And then the lower right is an example of a sensor where there's a bubble underneath that membrane, and you'll need to go ahead and do a membrane change on that. So these are just some examples of sensors that you might see and need to do a membrane change on or completely replace. So it's pretty simple. After each use, you're going to want to clean and disinfect the sensor. Now, we do recommend only using the 70% alcohol wipes on that sensor. If your cleaning protocol is required you to use, let's say, a gray or a purple top wipe, go ahead and do that, but follow that up with the 70% alcohol wipe. Those gray and purple top wipes have a lot of chemicals on them, and if left on the sensor or the monitor, it can damage it over time. So just wiping that off with the alcohol afterwards is going to prolong the life of not only the monitor, but the sensor. If you do have any further questions, you can refer to our cleaning and disinfecting agents overview that we have up on our website. Now, when that sensor needs to be calibrated at each site check or site change, it's pretty simple. All you need to do is remove the sensor from that attachment ring. In the NICU, we allow you to go up to 8 hours before you need to check and calibrate that sensor. And in the sleep lab, it allows you to actually go the whole way up to 12 hours. So you remove that from the attachment ring, gently clean off the surface of the sensor with the alcohol wipe, focus on the sides of that sensor head because there is the contact gel that might accumulate on there, briefly allow it to dry, and then place it back in the docking station door. Now, just as a reminder, you do want to make sure you place that sensor correctly in the door, so you want to see that red light. So see the red light, close the door, the monitor will automatically initiate a calibration. 5 minutes later, it should say ready for use, and you can put it back on that same patient again. Weekly, it's pretty simple as well. You're just going to want to clean and disinfect that monitor now, paying special attention to the docking station and the gasket, and I'll show you that in detail on the next slide, as well as cleaning and disinfecting the sensor adapter cable. So here's a picture of our SDM monitor. Weekly, just make sure you wipe that down with the 70% alcohol, and with the door open, you can see the gasket that I was referencing here in the docking station module. If you don't wipe off the contact gel from the sensor after every use, it will start to dry out and accumulate in here, and it can cause an increase in docking station leaks. So weekly, just making sure you gently wipe that gasket out, make sure there's no debris buildup in there. That's going to give you the best chance of not experiencing any docking station leaks. Now, if you all have been using this SDM for a while, you might not be familiar with our latest transcutaneous monitoring platform called the TCOM Plus. And here's a picture of that. And on there, we have a very similar design, but we placed that docking station on the right side of the monitor instead of the front. One thing that I will highlight is instead of the gasket, we're actually using an O-ring. So it doesn't matter which direction you place that O-ring, it's not going to cause any errors because of putting it in backwards like the SDM. The other thing that I will highlight on there is that we put a stronger spring behind this docking station module, which should reduce the likelihood of docking station errors. So If you want a demo on the TCOM Plus, please reach out to our sales team, your territory manager. They'd be happy to set up a demo for you and show you all the great improvements that we made on our latest generation TCOM platform. And then also weekly, you're going to want to go ahead and clean that sensor adapter cable. Just take a 70% alcohol wipe that cable down. That'll just keep any dirt from accumulating on there, any adhesive, and just give you the longest possible life on that sensor cable. So the monthly maintenance is where we want to spend most of our time today, because this is where you're going to do the membrane change and a lot of the other stuff that's really critical for our sensor to work properly. So monthly, you will want to visually inspect the monitor, the docking station, like you were doing on the weekly basis, but also check out that power cord. If the power cord's getting frayed or damaged, reach out to our team. We can get you a replacement on order, just because that would be a safety issue. The other thing that you want to make sure to do is perform a post-test. And what the post-test stands for is a power on self-test. So when you power the monitor on, it will go through that post-test and it'll automatically tell you if there is any failures throughout that. So let's say your census is low in the NICU, or maybe you don't have as many sleep studies in your sleep lab as you normally do, and maybe you have a couple monitors that are set to the side. It's still important to turn those monitors on at least once a month. And this is really why we encourage you to just keep these monitors turned on all the time, because as they're turned on, they are going to be more stable, more accurate, and give you a better overall experience. As far as the sensor goes, you'll want to visually inspect that sensor head and cable. On the next slide, I'll show you an up-close picture of the sensor and what you're looking for. You'll want to go ahead and do a sensor membrane change, as well as run a sensitivity test. And I'll talk about each of those in detail. So here's a nice exploded view of the sensor, front and back. Remember this silver chloride ring that I showed you earlier in the presentation? This is what you want it to look like. You want it to be brown and intact. And then you also want to make sure that the red LED light here is illuminated. On the back of the sensor, you'll want to check these joints where the sensor cable attaches to the sensor head. Make sure it's not fraying here, and also make sure that the neck of the sensor isn't separating away from that sensor. If it is, you'll want to go ahead and replace that sensor. Now you might ask, why is it important for us to change that membrane monthly? There's a thin electrolyte layer between the sensor face and the membrane that is really how our sensor technology works. It's a piece of how our sensor technology is working. And so as time passes, as the 28 days go, that electrolyte is going to slowly dry out. So that's why that needs to be replaced. Now, I often get the question, hey, I haven't used my monitor and sensor for the last 28 days. Do I still need to replace that membrane? And the answer is yes, because even when it's sitting on the shelf or in the closet, that electrolyte is still drying out. So with proper care and maintenance, the membrane should last 28 days, but there are factors that might contribute to a shorter membrane life. And one of those is the harsh cleaners that we already talked about. Those gray purple top wipes, they are really harsh on equipment, on sensors. They do start to break down plastics and other components on our technology over time. So making sure you're wiping that down with alcohol wipes afterwards is really important. Also, just inappropriately handling the sensors. So let's say you're in a NICU, you're in a hurry, and you quickly pull that sensor back through the grommets on the end of the isolette, that can damage it. So as you're pulling that through the grommet, be extra careful with it. Go slow. If you need to, just crack the door of the isolette open on the side so that you can gently remove that sensor cable. Also, just frequency of use is a factor for shortened membrane life. You're busy, accidents are going to happen. That's okay. If you need to replace it at 25 days instead of 28 days because there was a scratch or a scrape on the face of that membrane, that's going to happen from time to time. So just keep that in mind. The more you use this, the more you might see a membrane that needs to be replaced from time to time. The other thing that I do want to bring to your attention is any unapproved contact liquids. And what I'm talking about there is if you're using sterile water or saline instead of our contact gel. We do only recommend using our contact gel really for 3 reasons. One, the sterile water and saline is going to dry out very quickly. So it might work for 45 minutes or an hour, but then you're getting these readings that are 10 or 15 points higher than the blood gas value. And so it's not accurate anymore. The other problem with sterile water and saline is it actually causes our adhesive rings to lose adhesion and fall off the patient quicker. So you're actually spending more money on rings because of this. And then finally, specifically with the saline, as that dries out, it is going to leave a sodium residue behind and could be abrasive on the face of that membrane and, cause that membrane to need to be replaced before the 28 days. The final point that I want to make is if you're in an environment that's unusually dry, not very humid, you could see that electrolyte dry out just a little bit faster. We do have a great video on how to do that membrane change on our YouTube channel, also our product support page. So if you're new to transcutaneous monitoring, you've never done a membrane change, definitely check that out. It walks you through that step by step. So when that membrane change is due on the SDM, this is the screen that you're going to be seeing. So it'll automatically prompt you that that membrane change needs to be done every 28 days. So when you see this screen, you're not going to want to use it on a patient until you go ahead and do that membrane change. And then on the TCOM Plus, our newest monitor, our newest transcutaneous platform, this is the screen that'll automatically prompt you when that membrane change needs to be done. So a quick knowledge check. Take a look at the sensor here on the right. Is this sensor ready for use for patient monitoring? A, yes, this sensor is ready for patient monitoring. B, the electrolyte has dried out and the membrane must be changed before use. Or C, no, there are air bubbles beneath the membrane and the membrane must be changed before use. Take a close look at that sensor and pick the answer that you feel is appropriate. I actually don't see the poll popping up, so I wonder if maybe we have just a little bit of a glitch on the back end. So mentally, at least make note of what you would pick there. The answer to this question is B, no, the electrolyte has dried out and the membrane must be changed before use. I actually gave you this answer earlier in my presentation where I was showing you the color of that sensor face. So you want to look at that. It should be a dark gray color, and you see in this case, this sensor has a light gray, milky, hazy color to it, which is a good indication that that electrolyte has dried out, and you'll have to do that membrane change before you place it on a patient. So how do you know if the sensor was properly membraned? After going through that membrane change process, you do want to visually inspect that membrane. You want to make sure that there's no air bubbles under there. You also want to make sure that the membrane is seated properly. So look at the edges, make sure that's been seated properly on that sensor face. If you see an air bubble or the membrane isn't seated properly, unfortunately, you are going to have to go ahead and do a membrane change again. So following the membrane change, you want to confirm the membrane change on the monitor, allow that sensor to complete the mandatory calibration. Like I said before, that should take about 3 to 5 minutes. And then after that, ideally, you would give it another 90 minutes for that sensor to fully stabilize. So after the cal is done, it will say ready for use on there, but there'll be a 90-minute stabilization timer underneath that, just indicating to you that optimally, you would give it the 90 minutes before placing on the patient. Now, that said, if you're in a hurry and you need to use that monitor on a patient, go ahead and use it, but just keep in mind that it may not be quite as accurate when compared to the blood gas. Instead of 3 to 5 points off, maybe it might be 5 to 7 points off from there. And that's just because you weren't able to give it the full 90 minutes for the stabilization. To confirm the membrane change on the monitor, you will want to remove that sensor from the docking station, change the membrane, and then either just confirm it on the monitor, which I'll show you on the next screen, or if you had to change it early, you're going to have to go into the sub menu and select that membrane change done to initiate that or prompt it on the monitor. This is what the SDM looks like when you're doing that. So you just go into the menu, membrane change, and you click on membrane change done. Do make sure that the door is open on the SDM monitor. And then on the TCOM Plus, looks pretty similar. You can see here that it'll pop up on the screen. You click membrane change done. Again, you want to make sure that that door is open. So once you prompted the monitor that the membrane change is done, it'll reset that timer for another 28 days. Now, just a couple tips when you're changing that membrane. Don't pick up the membrane changer at any point during that process, especially when you're actually applying that new electrolyte onto the face of that sensor. If you picked up that membrane, that electrolyte could roll off of the face of the sensor, and obviously it wouldn't function the way it's intended. We do have sticky feet on the bottom of the membrane changers, so just remove the thin film on there, place that on a tabletop, a countertop, and that way you shouldn't have any issues with it. Press down for the 3 seconds firmly and release slowly. You don't want to try and press and turn ever at the same time because it could jam that membrane changer. And then the final 2 points here are ones that we've already talked about. There will be a mandatory calibration after you've done the membrane change and confirm that on the monitor, and then the 90-minute stabilization period that I already highlighted on the previous slide. Now, after you've done that membrane change, we would recommend doing what's called a sensitivity test. On the SDM, for all software, you can get there through the menu by clicking Menu, Measurement Settings, scrolling down to PCO2 settings, and in that submenu, you'll see sensitivity tests. Now, if sensitivity test isn't illuminated or you can't select it, make sure that the door is closed or open and close that door, and it should allow you to select that. Now, on the SDM, if you have the newer software, 8.05 or higher, we actually made this process even easier. We located it in the quick access menu. So just by clicking on that arrow to the left of the docking station door, you can get into that quick access menu and you see the sensitivity test there. On the TCOM Plus, you can find it in 2 places. You can either go through the menu on the left side here, click on Sensor Maintenance, and you'll see sensitivity test there. Or an even easier place to find it is from the main screen. Just click that sensor on the top bar, and that'll open the menu with the sensitivity test in 1 click. After you selected that sensitivity test on either the SDM or the TCOM Plus, it'll ask you to open the docking station door, and you'll keep that door open for 2 minutes. It's getting an ambient air reference value there. At the end of the 2 minutes on the older SDMs, it actually won't tell you to close the door. It'll just ask you to make sure that that sensor is in the docking station door, and it'll show you an icon on the screen. That's your indication to go ahead and close the door. Now, on the newer SDM software, it does actually tell you to close that door. And on the TCOM Plus, it gives you a visual cue on the monitor to close that docking station door. After you've closed that door, it's going to go through a leak test, a sensor calibration, and a sensitivity test. At this point, you can walk away. When you come back in 10 to 15 minutes, all those tests should be complete and it should say ready for use. Now, I will just highlight that this seems like a really long process, everything that I've just talked about here for the monthly maintenance. But once you've done this a couple times, the membrane change should take about 10 to 15 seconds. You'll prompt the monitor that you did that, and then you'll initiate the sensitivity test. I would encourage you to stay with the monitor for the 2 minutes that the door is open, but after that, you can walk away. So really, the entire process should only take you a couple minutes, and then you can move on to your next task or maybe the next monitor that needs a membrane change. Again, if you need further details on how to do this sensitivity test, we have a great video on our product support page, our YouTube channel, that walks you through this step by step. The final thing that I want to cover here today is our quarterly maintenance. And you see, it's just there's one thing that we need to do. Nothing to the monitor, but the sensor, we do recommend doing a clean and soak on a quarterly basis. And many of you might not be familiar with how to do that clean and soak, or maybe you weren't even aware that you needed to do something on a quarterly basis to the sensor. So I want to just talk through step by step how we do that. So before doing that membrane change, you want to take the sensor and remove the old membrane with the tool on the bottom of the membrane changer. So just flip that membrane changer over. There's a horseshoe-shaped tool on there. You insert that sensor and just gently lift up, and that old membrane should pop off. After that, you're going to soak the sensor in clean room temperature water for up to 3 minutes. It is important that you don't allow that sensor to soak for too long in the water. That's why we recommend it 3 minutes. If you forget it in there and you come back 20 or 30 minutes later, that long of a clean and soak could damage the sensor. So just keep that in mind. I would recommend staying with that sensor, setting a timer on your phone, whatever you need to do to make sure you get that sensor out of the water after the 3 minutes. At the end of the clean and soak, you'll want to put a lint-free gauze in the palm of your hand and just gently pat that sensor face dry. Be extra careful because when the sensor doesn't have the membrane on it, it could get damaged, scraped, or scratched. So be gentle with it, just pat it dry, and then go ahead and do that membrane change like we just talked about. Now, as a pro tip, I will just share that as the contact gel builds up on there, it can dry in a way that that membrane may not want to come off of there very easily with the membrane change tool that I talked about. So go ahead and soak it with that old membrane on it for about a minute, and that membrane should pop right off of there. Now, keep in mind, after soaking it for that minute with the membrane on, you'll want to go ahead and soak it for the 3 minutes like I already talked about with that membrane removed. After all that's done, go ahead and do a sensitivity test and you should be good to go. So quarterly, we're going to want to just go ahead and do that clean and soak before the membrane change, do the membrane change, prompt the monitor that you did that, and initiate a sensitivity test. If you need any further instructions on that, again, we have a great video that highlights all those steps. So in summary, the proactive maintenance that you want to be doing on your transcutaneous monitor is the following. Before and after each use, inspect that sensor, carefully clean and disinfect the sensor. Weekly, you're going to want to make sure to clean and disinfect the monitor. Spend some extra time on that docking station. Make sure the gasket is not contaminated or the O-ring on the TCOM Plus. And then also make sure to wipe the sensor adapter cable. Monthly, you'll want to visually inspect the monitor and sensor, perform that post-test, go ahead and do the membrane change like I've talked about, and follow that membrane change up with a sensitivity test. And then finally, the quarterly maintenance, you're just adding a clean and soak before doing that membrane change 4 times a year. So you do that clean and soak, do the membrane change, followed by the sensitivity test. I'll say if you implement these proactive strategies into your TCOM fleet, I am confident that you will have a better overall experience with our technology. I believe it's going to be more accurate for you. You're going to see less sensor errors, less docking station leaks, and really the monitor is going to cause you less frustrations overall. So I hope that this information was helpful. Thanks for taking the last 25 minutes to review this with us. I'm going to turn it back over to Brad, but please stay around afterwards here because we are going to open it up for questions and answers.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Jason, so much for that wonderful presentation. And so before we get into the Q&A, we have a couple QR codes that you could scan. So the first one here, if you scan that one, that's going to take you to our product support page where you can find TCOM Plus and SDM support materials such as bedside tip sheets, competency checklist, as well as e-learning modules for bedside clinicians, correlation experts, and maintenance and troubleshooting experts. On the next slide here, if you scan this QR code, it's going to take you to our Sentec events page where you'll find a couple of on-demand CE opportunities as well as some other webinars we'll have in the near future. So with that, we'll get into our questions that we have for Jason. So Jason, the first one here is, if we're using our monitors only periodically, do we still need to change the sensor membrane before monitoring?
Yeah, so this is a question that we get pretty frequently, and especially for those sleep labs that maybe, you're only doing a couple studies a month, or you have a NICU that the census is low, you're not using those monitors. The answer is yes, we do still need to go ahead and do that membrane change because of what I talked about with the electrolyte drying out. So even when it's sitting on that shelf, sitting in your equipment room or in the closet, that electrolyte is still drying out over the 28 days. When you turn that monitor back on, it is going to require you to do that membrane change. So it's just another reason for you to keep those monitors turned on, ready for use, and using them on patients as often as possible.
Perfect. And then you mentioned the clean and soak for the quarterly maintenance. What kind of water should be used on those clean and soaks?
Yeah, so it's totally fine for you to use tap water for that. You can grab a cup, fill that up with some tap water. Just make sure that it's not overly hot or cold. Ideally, it would be somewhere around room temperature. The other thing that I'll just point out is that a lot of times I recommend grabbing a bottle of sterile water. You have those readily available. They're already at room temperature. And a lot of times they have that, there's a cap on top of them already. And so you don't have the tendency to spill that cup over and make a mess. So yeah, either tap water or sterile water if you have it.
Perfect. And another question here in regard to the clean and soak. So they mentioned sometimes they have an issue getting the membrane off the sensor using that little horseshoe shape on the bottom of the membrane changer. Do you have any recommendations for how to get that membrane off the sensor?
Yeah, the best recommendation I can make is just to soak it with that old sensor on it in some water for about a minute. There's two things that are happening. Either the gel, the contact gel that you're using is kind of accumulating on the sides and drying and holding that membrane in place. Or the other thing that I've seen is that the electrolyte has dried out so much, it's completely dry under there, that the membrane is actually sticking to the face of the sensor. So just soak that for 1 to 2 minutes in room temperature water. That should allow you to remove it. And then again, make sure you're soaking that sensor without the membrane on it for the 3 minutes like we recommend.
Perfect. And then when it comes to the membrane changes, there's a comment here. Sometimes they have an issue where they get to the last step and the membrane is missing. Do you have any recommendations on just kind of that membrane change process?
Yeah, the biggest recommendation I can make, the probably the most common reason for that membrane not being on there properly is just not pressing hard enough on the top of the membrane changer. A lot of people feel like they're gonna break it, or they just aren't pressing hard enough on there. You will hear a very distinct snap, crackle, pop when you're doing that fourth step there to put that new membrane on. And as soon as you hear that pop, you're like, oh, maybe I broke something. And you haven't. You just haven't pushed hard enough to get that seated completely on that sensor face. So, best recommendation I can make is use the sticky feet on the bottom, put it on a table or a counter, and press firmly, almost like best analogy I can make is almost like you're giving this thing CPR, right? Really nice, firm, steady press should eliminate the possibility of that membrane not being on there properly.
Yeah, perfect. And then you may have mentioned this already, Jason, but regarding, turning the monitor off, turning it back on, and it's recommending that stabilization period. Even though the sensor does calibrate, do you still recommend waiting that 90 minutes or that 45 minutes, like say after a sensor membrane change, before you put the sensor back on the patient?
Ideally, yes, we would wait 45 or 90 minutes, just because that is going to allow that sensor to fully stabilize and give you the best chance of correlating within just a couple points of the arterial blood gas or the cap gas that you're going to be drawing. But if it says ready for use, even if that stabilization timer is in place, you can use it on a patient. Just keep in mind that it may not be as accurate. But yeah, ideally, you would allow that stabilization timer to complete.
Perfect. Yeah, and you'd mentioned in the previous webinar that if you're working in a sleep lab and you are turning the monitors off, turning them back on, and if you don't let it get through the stabilization period, so not only will it not be as accurate, but you may not get the total site time as well.
Right, correct.
Yeah, and
And
especially in the sleep lab. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I ran into that a couple weeks ago where the SDMs, the sleep lab that was using SDMs was complaining about the site timer expiring at 2 or 3 a.m. And after I started asking a couple questions, discovered they were turning the monitors off at the end of the night in the morning, and then turning them back on at like 7:30 or 8 p.m. right before the sleep study. And so not only wasn't it didn't have enough time to finish that stabilization timer, but it will default to a 6 hour sight time when you initially turn the monitor on. Takes about 3 to 4 hours for it to default back up to the 8 or the 12 hours. So it is a little bit of a nuanced thing on our monitors. Just keep that in mind, especially for the sleep labs. If you can get those turned on earlier in the day, or ideally just keep them turned on all the time and don't turn them off at the end of the night, that is going to give you the opportunity to go the full study without having to go in and disturb the patient.
Perfect. All right, so I think we got to all the questions. Thank you so much, Jason, for answering these questions, and thank you to everyone that joined us for this product support webinar. And again, Jason, thanks for the wonderful presentation. So I hope you all have a good rest of your day.
Have a great day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.